Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This episode of GardenDC, we're talking to Allan Armitage. He's a professor of horticulture, an industry visionary, garden writer, garden speaker. He has online classes, authored many books, and one of his latest ventures was an app called Armitage's Great Garden Plants. Welcome, Allan.
Hi, Kathy. How are you? It's great to be with you.
Great to be with you, too. So are you joining us from Athens, Georgia, or are you somewhere else out and about?
No, the out and about stuff is not doing real well these days, so I am definitely home, and I am living in beautiful Athens, Georgia, which is in the foothills of the Smokies, and where the home of the University of Georgia is, and having just, I'm not doing a whole lot. It's winter here, too. It's kind of dreary out there today, but still thinking about all the cool plants we're going to be doing this spring and all the cool people I'm going to be talking to for a good long time online, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Unfortunately, but somewhat fortunately, you get to have some more interaction with people internationally and
Yeah.
almost some more outreach, don't you think?
Oh, listen, I hope, I don't know what we're going to talk about today, Kath. You're going to lead the way and we can talk about every plant known to man. But one of the things that I've really come to appreciate is, we're in this horticulture business, in this, whether it's a vegetable or whether it's a shrub or ornamentals or whatever. But the fact is that COVID, and believe me, I can chat about COVID forever, but what COVID has really brought to light is that gardening is essential. And I don't say that just as sort of a tongue in cheek thing. Gardening has become essential. We have, over 16 million new gardeners apparently this year. I mean, gardening businesses are doing just fine, thank you. And it's because gardening, as we all know, it's not just fun and colorful and pretty, it's
Mm-hmm.
therapeutic. And boy, if we need one thing this year, it's therapy. And I think all these people are coming out of the woodwork, and whether or not they stay with us, we'll find out soon enough. But they're coming out of the woodwork because, hey, they've discovered that an African violet at home is kind of cool, or a tree or a shrub, or boy, my tomato actually got a real tomato. So we are essential, and I'm proud to say it, and I hold my head up high when I say that we are essential.
I 100% agree with you there, Alan. So if you heard that background noise, that was a Maine Coon cat jumping on my paperwork and knocking things down. But
Good for you.
he agrees totally that we are essential. Gardening is essential, and plants being part of our lives. I mean, we have chlorophyll in our veins, right?
We do. And again, it's we kind of used to, I used to always say that, we make the world a prettier place, if not a better place. Well, heck, Kathy, we make the world a better place. And it's not like I'm trying to pat myself on the back or any of us. It's just become obvious. And we've always kind of sort of known that, talk to each other very well, but I have no problem telling anybody who asks. Yes, I am in horticulture. I'm a gardener, and come join me because you'll do much better in your life with a plant and dirty fingernails than you've done before.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know what happened that the world forgot, but I'm glad that at least what came out of it was that they were reminded,
You
and
got
that
that right.
also beauty has a place. Like, I think
Absolutely.
for so many years, beauty was downplayed or enjoyment was
Yeah.
almost like a dirty word or something.
It's kind of interesting too that gardening kind of got this little old lady in a hat pulling weeds vision. It was just gardening. I'm a gardener, yada yada. But not so, not so. I mean, the people that we're talking to, your audience, if they are the crazy people in the Mid-Atlantic area, and I know many of them, I mean, it's not like I hope they have a hat on, but they also know what they're doing. And if they don't know what they're doing, they're quite happy to figure out what they're doing. This is gardening. It's not brain surgery. We're supposed to have fun. And I think that if if we keep that in mind by not taking ourselves too seriously or what we do too seriously, um, we'll make the place a much prettier and much better.
Hmm. Here on that. I'll raising my glass of water to you.
I got a glass of water here too. We should have done it at 5 o'clock.
Exactly. I was like, next time cocktails, but
Mhm.
this time, we'll just have the water and a little bit of sustenance looking out at the garden, even on a dreary winter day. There's still plenty going on out there. And then in the gardening world in general, we just came off of 3 days of the MANTS show, which is the Mid Atlantic Nursery Trade Show. And you were part of the perennial farm in that, correct?
I was, yeah. Uh-huh.
So normally you would be flying up here to Baltimore, and the show, the Mance event, takes over the entire Baltimore Convention Center, and several local hotels are booked up. All the restaurants are overrun by these plant nerds and
Mhm.
garden geeks and landscapers and designers and plant breeders, and it's all crazy. But this year, obviously, it happened virtually. How was your experience working the virtual show for Perennial Farm?
Well, I think probably many of those listening have not had the fortune of being able to get to that trade show. Uh, the Mance is certainly one of the major trade shows, and this in this case in the ornamental plant industry. There's only two or three. I mean, there's a ton of trade shows and smaller ones, but if you want to see somebody from any state in the Union or Canada or Holland or Germany, you'll go to Mance or one in Columbus, Ohio in the summer. So it's unfortunate that we can't see each other because that's truly what is interacting, not just what's the newest plant, gee, what's the newest idea, but how are you? How have you been? What's new in your life? And so we think we can do that anyway, but we did the best we can with virtual, and it's so wonderful that Mance has gone to the trouble and done as much as it can do to keep these things going because we do want to find out what's new. We do want to find out what great ideas or programs are being going on out there. And so I think it was good. I did my thing. I work with a perennial farm, which is just outside Baltimore. It's a wonderful perennial nursery. Uh, they have an online uh, retail thing as well that you can buy plants from them online. But it's not quite the same as looking at the audience face to face and telling a bad joke and seeing them cringe. But the fact is, they're there for a reason. They're there to listen to what's new or what the speaker thinks, and we're able to do that. So I was happy with it. I'm fine with digital. I'd rather be in person, but I'm fine.
Hmm. And I know that for our listeners and who want to access him, it's not just a generic name, The Perennial Farm. That's the name. Capital T, P, and F. So The Perennial Farm. It's perennialfarm.com.
Yeah,
And they're based in Glen Arm, Maryland. So check that out. And they have links right now to Alan's presentations that were posted on Facebook, so that anybody, not just those in the industry, could check out those videos on Facebook.
they also have for the gardeners in the audience who are looking for. I hope everybody who buys a plant will buy local, go to your garden centers, help them out as much as you can. You'll find good help, good people there. But if you're looking for online source, uh, it's called the Perennial Farm Marketplace.com, and that's an online source for the plants that the Perennial Farm sells. So, there's another source for you to find good plants.
And so I know one of the most popular lines with the Perennial Farm is the dear, I'm going to say it wrong,
I know you won't.
Dearlicious. I almost said dearlicious, which would be the opposite, right, of what they're
Yeah.
intending. So the Dearlicious plants line, or plants that deers don't like to eat. It says here.
Well,
Um,
it is called Delirious, and it's a program. Well, let's just do this deer thing because every one of your listeners has deer issues. I guarantee that, and Kathy, if you go out to speak to a group, the first, second, or third question you're going to get is, "What about deer?" It's
mhm.
a guarantee question. And we can click our nails and bite our fingers and all those kind of things about deer, or we can try to understand the problem. So there's a ton of plants that deer are not going to eat immediately. If you put a hosta out, they're going to eat it. I don't even care if they're hungry or not. They're going to eat it. If you put a verbena out or a lantana out, they're not going to eat it. So there's a whole lot of in-betweens. And so the Deerlerius program, you'll see that mostly at garden centers, independent garden centers. They have these programs where they have whole benches of plants for the sun or plants for the shade that deer won't eat. And there are a lot more than you think. I mean, if you got a herd of deer in your backyard, I build a fence. But if you got two or three that are coming through all the time, and your garden isn't too big, there's lots of ways in which you can reduce the problem with deer. And people give me heck all the time. They're just there all the time, these deer. But the fact is, there are decent, deer repellents if you have a small garden. There are lots of selection you can do. And you say, well, how do I know? Well, and again, if you don't mind me saying, I developed this app called Armitage's Great Garden Plants that you mentioned, and every single plant on that app has a deer browsing and, in fact, a rabbit browsing rating as well. So if there's a browsing rating of 5, like a hosta, just beware. If it's a browsing rating of 1 or 2, you're a little bit better off. So that's the deal. But the Perennial Farm has come up with a really cool program, and based on research, you may add, not just sort of somebody who thinks that a deer isn't going to eat it, but research based from university trials.
Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that it's rated. It's not just deer do or don't, because we all
No,
know
no way.
that they're living beings and they all have different taste buds, or mama deer taught her little does something else than the other band of deer that live by you have learned. So
Yeah.
things change also.
Well, I'm sure you've had lots of people on your podcast about deer and stuff, and the fact is, it's with us, and we just have to deal with it, or stick our head in the sand, or just not even care. But the fact is, there are ways to deal with it. I'm quite, whenever I talk anywhere, I say, hey, it's a problem, but we can do something about it, or at least we can try. So it's not the end of the world.
Exactly. No reason to give up your entire garden
No,
just because
no.
a little bit of nibbles. So, on a lighter note, I wanted to talk a little bit about Dr. Allan Armitage's journey into plants. So, were you born with
Oh God.
chlorophyll in your veins, or did you jump out with some seeds in your hand and sprinkle them
Okay.
around the room?
Okay. All right. Look, now I got to tell you some things here, and you're going to laugh, and you're going to say, "Oh, this guy's really nuts." And I'm also, if you really want to know, I can really give you some specifics. But the fact is, no, I didn't have a grandmother that patted me on the head. I didn't have parents that loved gardening. I don't know. Well, I do know where it started, but it's certainly, I went through high school without ever picking up a plant. I went to college, undergrad college in Canada, and I did study botany. At least I studied plants, but
Hmm.
nothing to do with gardening. I was studying the science of botany, and nothing to do with. I didn't even take a horticultural class in college. And but I'm going to keep this real short. But one of the things that did happen is that I took a job in college, and I can't make this up. I was a grave digger. So this was back when you literally dug a grave. I didn't even use a backhoe at that time. It was
Wow.
a big hole, I want to tell you. But in Canada, at least where I lived in Montreal area, when you say constant care in a cemetery, it doesn't mean just cutting the grass. What it means is that the grave site, the dirt, is planted in a garden. So we had a little greenhouse at this cemetery, and we planted, ajugas and little alternantheras and colorful things, and we made a garden, at least a beautiful setting on that dirt. And so I'm going to finish this up in a minute. I'm sorry. So one day, hot. It does every now and then. Even Montreal gets hot. It was hot. I was tired. It was around 5 o'clock, and I was trying to get out of there, but there was a group, a family, a grieving family coming up the hill to visit their newly buried, back turned out to be father. And, they were really upset, of course. And when they came to this gravesite, Kathy, they just stopped and just smiled as best as one who is grieving can smile. They looked, they chatted, they said, "This is lovely." And behind that tree, I said something. I was a little slow. I still am. Something said, maybe this garden thing, there's more to it than what I think. And that was a first little click. And that took me another bunch of years before it ever fell in place. But that was my first click as a grave digger, planting graves, that I realized how people appreciate beauty and just taking a little care. So
Wow.
that's
I
and
can't say I
actually,
know anybody else with that origin, but starting with the soil, there's something there. There's something
there's
there, and
something there, and
yeah.
it was just such a kind of a little light bulb coming off of my head. It quickly went out again, I may add, but it did come on. And in fact, if anybody truly is interested in this, you asked the story, I was challenged, in fact, by the people at the Perennial Farm, because I tell stories all the time when I'm giving talks, not just about myself, but just about all sorts of stuff. And they challenged me to write a book, a small book about how I got from there to here. And it's on my website. It's called "It's Not Just About the Hat," and so you can read my graveyard stories among other things as well. But so that's how I guess that's probably the beginning. It took a while to gel, but that's how the beginning.
Hmm. And then what was your next step to become a
Well,
professional in horticulture?
to be so I was a high school teacher. After I now I was so
Hmm.
I have just recently, by the way, my wife and I, a year and a half, 2 years ago, we've been in the United States over 35 years, but we're Canadian. And just recently, a year and a half or so ago, we became citizens. So you now have us forever. We have dual citizenship, of course, but what we did is we were citizens so that we could do what everybody does, really should do, and that's vote. And so, in fact, this whole last craziness, we were able to exercise our ability to vote. So, when I talk about my time in Canada, it's because that's where I grew up. I've been here for many, many years. But so to get to where I am, I was a high school teacher in the Montreal area, and I taught math and biology. But I also I don't know why, Kathy, I just happen to like this stuff. I like getting some tulips and putting them in the ground in the fall. I like putting some petunias or in lily of the valleys into the garden in our little house that we had. And all of a sudden, people were asking me, "What do I put in?" And I kind of figured it out. And so all of a sudden, I was doing a little bit of gardening, not for people, but at least helping them out. And then in the summer times, as a high school teacher, I had the summers off. I did that thing that people, the professionals, really hate. I bought a little red truck and I got a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and away I went. I became a landscaper. So that in my summertime. And again, I'm not really all that comfortable talking about myself, but they're funny stories because I smile when I think about them. But I hired in Montreal, and there was only two groups of people that were in the landscape business. One were French, and the others were Italian. My name is Armitage, but in Quebec it's pronounced Armitage. And I worked with my buddy Louis Santini. Now he couldn't speak a word of Italian, but it didn't really matter. We were off to the races, and we started doing things in the summer, and one thing led to another, and eventually, and it's all in that crazy book, things are going crazy in Montreal area. So it was time to make a decision. And after 7, 8 years of teaching high school, which I truly loved, I love teachers and I love high school teaching. It was time to make a decision. That's when I decided to get into horticulture.
But I'm sure that teaching experience, still works today and still comes through,
Oh,
I think, in a lot of your talks and things.
well,
And yeah, I think once a teacher, always a
I like
teacher.
people too.
But but that summer off, those summers off sure
Well,
help.
it did help, but it was coming. And what was happening is, you got a job or two, and then all of a sudden had more. And then over the years, I was doing, the gardening was starting to interfere with the teaching. I had to make a decision. And the decision was a little easier than you would think, just because of various things going on in the province at that time. But nevertheless, that's what happened. Not in my wildest dreams I ever think I'd be doing what I'm doing today.
Hmm. And I think that's a great lesson for all of those who have come later to gardening or didn't grow up in a gardening household, that you don't have to be born with a garden hoe in your hand, so to speak. And you don't have to have land that you cultivated as a child, although that's a common story of having a little childhood plot or something. But nobody was born knowing everything.
No, nobody, nobody will die knowing everything either. So let's
Exactly.
just enjoy what we can do.
So, looking at your long list of books, I'm just scrolling through Amazon for some of the titles, and I'm sure a lot of listeners out there have several of your titles on their bookshelf, from your manual of annuals and biennials and half-hardy perennials to herbaceous perennial plants to vines and climbers. And then, of course, you came out a few years ago with a really fun book of Naked Ladies and Forget-Me-Nots, the
Mhm.
stories behind the common names of some of your favorite plants. So that, I imagine, is from some of your storytelling passions.
Yeah. Again, well, now again, I make no excuses or make. I'm not embarrassed to say that I'm a writer. I love what I do, and I just happen to. And of course, if you're a university professor, you better be a writer. But the writing I've done with the books, of course, that all just sort of came out of. I just enjoy writing, and my very first book, I think, was 60 pages, and it was all about, it was all about how to grow stuff in a greenhouse, because I was in the greenhouse side of the research, and so many of my original books were just for greenhouse operators, or truly just the professionals. And then I started my book on herbaceous perennial plants. I don't know, 1989, 19, I don't know when it was. But, that was the first, well, I won't say the first, it was one of the books that people really enjoyed, because I got right down to the nitty gritties. I was opinionated, plus talking about cultivars that worked. And that was the first edition. And just what, 2, 3 months ago, the fourth edition has appeared. And it's bigger, better, and truly you know, more inclusive. And it's written not just for you, Kathy, and not just for the craziest gardener out there in the Mid-Atlantic area, but it's also written for my neighbors, my daughters, and anybody who likes plants, because it's not. Hopefully, it's not too dry anyway. But anyway, so the Naked Lady book, that was great. That's probably the bestseller, just because it's an inexpensive book, but it's just fun. I mean, who was Joe Pye? I mean, good grief, why are carrots said to be good for your eyes? What's a dogwood got to do with dogs? So where do these names actually come from? So that's been a fun book, and they're all available, by the way, for anybody who's interested on my website. You can go through Amazon by all means, but they're not any cheaper or anything better there. And if if you really want to lose value on the book, I can sign it and personalize it for you too. And the website is just my name, allanarmitage.net, and you can do that there if you like.
Great. And we'll put a link to that in the podcast notes so everybody can go straight there as well. And so that brings us to plants and
Mm.
plant obsessions and new plants. So, is there such thing as a brand new? We always talk about new plants on the market, but are we just talking about improvements or tweaks, or are we talking about some really cool brand new stuff?
Well, if you're talking about today, as in here we are today, I just gave a talk on new plants that the Perennial Farm was introducing, and other companies were doing the same thing, talking about their new plants. So certainly, there's a bunch of new plants and to be more direct, to answer your question, most are improvements, or hopefully they're improvements. Sometimes I'm not so sure about that, but uh, nobody ever heard of Calibracoa when it was first introduced, 20 years ago. Nobody ever heard of that thing. Nobody ever heard of Scaevola when it was first introduced. I mean, even some of the new hybrids of Digiplexus and all that kind of stuff. Nobody ever heard of those, even though maybe they're a little suspect in their breeding. The fact is there are brand new things, but those are few and far between. If you go to, and I'm very fortunate, and Catherine, I don't know if you've been there, but if you go to California in the spring, they have this, essentially, it's called the California Spring Trials. And all the breeders of least ornamentals and shrubs and some veggies are showing off their new stuff. And it's for the growers and the major retailers. And so if you see that, I'll show you, if you come with me, I'll show you, I'll show you 30 new petunias. I'll show you, a dozen. Oh, heck, I'll show you more than that. New zinnias or marigolds or whatever else. But they're all a little bit better. They're all trying to be a little bit better than what was there before. But there are a lot of new plants, to be sure. I mean, a lot of fun plants that I really get excited about, and I'm really, really love to trial them, which I do as much as I can here.
And what are some of your favorites that would be maybe hitting the garden centers this coming
Well,
spring?
okay, let's do the absolute favorite that's been hitting the garden center for a few years. They just keep getting better, and that's the Lenten roses or hellebores. So the hellebores, and again, maybe it's just because I'm biased and I just think they're so useful. Remember, and again, I shouldn't say why I'm saying remember. In my opinion, most gardeners, and even the ones who are listening here, most gardeners, and certainly their friends, go into the garden center not necessarily looking for any particular cultivar, new plant, maybe not even a particular plant at all. They're looking for solutions to their garden problems. They're looking for the plants that have fragrance because their grandmother had plants that had fragrance. They're looking for plants that we already mentioned deer don't eat. They're looking for plants that attract pollinators. So the whole solution gardening, again, is my passion. I truly believe that everybody in this industry ought to understand that most people are going for solutions, not plants. But having said that, it's the plant that takes care of the problem. So hellebores are one of those things. I can talk about the beauty of hellebores till I'm red in the face. I love them. But not only are they beautiful, they're so functional. They tolerate shade. And I'm going to get to the new stuff in a minute. They tolerate shade. The deer don't eat them unless they are absolutely starving. They have flowers now that stand straight up so you can see them. And many of the newer ones have extraordinary foliage that's either glossy green or even variegated that stay looking good all season. So, if you said, is there anything new? It's just exploded in the last 5 years, the breeding. All hellebores orientalis, which is most of what your group has, were all seed propagated. And you never quite knew what you were going to get. So this is a huge breakthrough, certainly for landscapers, certainly for gardeners and designers. Anyway, so I don't, and it's called, by the way, the ones that are variegated, if you go to your local garden center, just ask for the Frost Kiss series. Frost Kiss. And if you can't find them, again, Perennial Farm Marketplace has them. And there's a ton of them. There's a ton of others, but that's those are the ones I can mention in the time we have.
Hmm. Yeah, the frost kiss are just incredible, just the foliage
Mm,
themselves. Um, but I've also, in the talk today, was hearing that they're sterile, that they don't
mm,
seed around,
right, exactly.
and that's one complaint. The only complaint I guess I've heard about hellebores.
Well, it's interesting. One person's garbage, another man's treasure, I guess. I think that's a good trait. Uh, the fact that they aren't reseeding means that the flowers are persisting longer. They're not going to seed. Plants that go to seed, tend to do that, and so the flower itself goes through the various evolution to produce seed and doesn't look as good for as long a period of time. I think that's a good thing. The
Hmm.
other thing, this is, and I mentioned Frost Kiss. There's one called Ice and Roses. There's a whole bunch of newer ones out there, Gold Series, that are, as you say, sterile. But that's the least of the problems because the flowers are upright, the foliage is good, and they're a designer's dream. They're a landscaper's dream. In that this is a design. This is a true plant for the garden as opposed to as a ground cover. I love orientalis. Believe me, there's still lots and lots of room for the good old Hellebores orientalis. It seeds everywhere. In fact, as fortunate as I am, it's one of my worst weeds around here. I can't get rid of the darn stuff. There's so many of them. But they do the job. They're essentially a great ground cover. But these new ones, to me, sterile or not, are just that's not a complaint.
And since they're not seed propagated, is that what's called tissue
Yeah,
culture or clonal?
yeah, they're clonal, and clonal just means that whether it's a cutting or it's a vegetative means rather than a sexual means, i.e., seed. Uh, so all the hellebores you're getting today are all tissue cultures. They're all essentially started in a lab somewhere. And you can divide them as a gardener, but you're not going to be able to take cuttings or anything like that from any hellebore for that matter. So that's why they're more expensive. One of the reasons they're more expensive is there's a lot more to do to get these things ready. But having said that, well, you'll spend the same amount of money at a burger doodle you're going to spend on a frost kiss, and it's going to be a whole heck of a lot better for you. So yeah, they're all clonal. They're all
So that does bring up plant breeding and how plants are brought to market. And so some of these new hellebores, this can take a decade or more before you've got a selection that is ready for the market. Are you involved in that trialing and that
oh
process?
well. Of course, you mentioned I'm at the University of Georgia. I retired from the university, and I recommend retirement to anybody who's a gardener. But the fact is that I started the whole trial program at the University of Georgia. We looked at every plant known to man almost because we had every company who wanted to put the plants in the garden, so I could look at them and talk to people like you about them. So yeah, I very much, and I'm still involved in the trialing process. Heck, I trial stuff at home just because, not that I know anything, but every now and then people think that people listen to me. So they send me some plants so I can say good things if they're any good. And certainly the hellebores have been something I've been looking at for a long time. And but plant breeding, hellebores are, as I say, they're tissue culture and all. But there's a lot of plants that are still bred the old-fashioned way, a seed and put it on the pistil and let it the pollen, put it on a pistil and make it a seed and then collect the seeds and see what you have. There's still a lot of that done, but it does take time. There is no doubt that anything you see, and especially anything you see called an F1 hybrid, there's a lot of breeding going into that.
And some of the ones that are being developed today are either a purposeful selection. Say you start, I don't know, 1,000 hydrangea
Right.
or 1,000 hellebore or whatever it might be, and then over several years you're looking for traits, going out in the growing field and looking at these and saying nope
Mhm.
to that one and ripping that one out and getting it down to the few uh, that make the test. But then there's the ones that are accidentally found. Can you talk about some of those happy accidents?
Sure. Well, let me just talk about your first thing about breeders. Good, and there's only about 30 major breeders in the world. Now, there's lots of backyard breeders. Don't get me wrong, but there's not a lot of breeders that are doing ornamentals, including hydrangeas, etc. There's just a very few people. So the idea of what you're looking for, the breeders have to get their money out of this eventually. So sometimes if they don't quite get that beautiful, clear pink they want, maybe it's going to be a muddy pink, but it's better than what they've had. If the thing doesn't flower quite as much as they would like it to, they might introduce it. But the difficulty with introducing too many things, hydrangeas being a perfect example, euchres being another example, echinacea being another example, is that if you introduce too many things and some of them aren't as good as they should be, it reflects on the new stuff that might be better. So, the trialing, which used to take, nothing ever got into the marketplace. I'll say 20 years ago. What do I know? But years ago, never got into the marketplace. At least 3-4 years of trialing. Today it's maybe a year, and that's only because they have to. But and I'm not dissing them. I'm not saying it's bad. That's just the way it is. But so the breeders and the big companies, everything is patented. I mean, everything. So, I mean, everything, every hydrangea, every euchre, every lily, every monarda, every anything is patented so that the breeders can, you know, keep their investments safe. In other words, you cannot take a cutting and sell it. You can take a cutting and stick it in your garden. I mean, who cares? But well, actually, you're not supposed to, but everybody does. The other thing. So what that does is it actually limits the number of plants that a breeder is going to work on. And you mentioned before, what's really new? Well, it's really hard to come up with anything really new because the
Hmm.
marketplace usually isn't ready for it, and therefore the breeder is not going to spend a lot of time or money trying to find something really new, unless it's just somehow some crazy, spectacular thing like a original caliper or
Hmm.
something. And again, just stop me. But to answer your second part, what about happy surprises? Well, I'm going to just give you two examples that probably most of the listeners have heard of or know of. One of them was a verbena called Homestead Purple. Now, it's not as big. It only sells about 5 million today, where it used to sell 20 million. But it's probably just a wonderful uh, example of what I call horticultural eyeballs. The people who found it said, "Hey, this looks really good." They knew their stuff, and they said, "Hey, let's try and bring it out and put it in the garden and see what people think." Uh, it became an instant seller all over the world. And Verbena Homestead Purple, if you don't have it, get it. It's still one of the best and most reliable verbenas out there. The other one, and again, I mentioned this, and I mentioned a second one here, is something that many people use as an annual, and it's a sweet potato. Now, just ask yourself back when, who in the heck in their right mind would breed a sweet potato for ornamental purposes? The
Hmm.
answer is nobody. But by good gosh, good golly, and good luck, um, a sweet potato was brought to, well, actually, not to me, but it doesn't matter, brought to this fella. And it was part of a sweet potato research program in Louisiana. And the lady who was a volunteer was a gardener. She jumped into the dumpster to get this purple leaf sweet potato that was a lousy producer of the tuber, but was quite pretty. And she put it in her garden. It eventually got back to me. It was, she said, well, let's call it Blackie. So we put it out there and let people look at it. And from Blackie, I received from, again, it's a cool story. All these are in the Naked Lady book too. Uh, cool story. This guy said, gee, my grandmother has this crazy sweet potato that she's had for a while. It has chartreuse leaves. You want to try it? So I stuck it in the gardens, and oh my God, Marguerite, that we call it Marguerite, and Marguerite sweet potato is is everywhere, and uh, and that was just happy and wonderful, good luck, good golly, and but also people who knew what they were doing. And today, from that Verbena Homestead Purple, a ton of new verbenas have arisen from those two sweet potatoes, Blackie and Margarita. I mean, breeders, I mean, real honest to goodness breeders have come up with about a dozen new cultivars of sweet potatoes. So to answer your question, sure, some of those things happen, but they're few and far between because and getting fewer and further because the money is into the big ticket items.
Hmm. And that was a good point you made that uh, a lot of plant breeders aren't going to take a big chance on something completely new to the market because they just don't know if it'll sell. So, if there's something just bizarre or out
Right,
there,
right.
it's that's hard to get across to the gardening public because I know a lot of us we have our spring annual shopping list, and that might include Homestead Purple and a couple margarita
Sure.
sweet potatoes, and then we make a beeline to those plants and we leave the garden center. Are we are we really looking at the new stuff?
Yeah.
Unless you see it in somebody else's garden, or maybe you go to a public garden and you're like, "What's that?"
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a great way
Exactly.
to.
and
Hmm?
and you with the Washington D.C. with the publications you guys do, you're gonna sometimes show fabulous plants, and you better make sure that these are available because there's nothing worse than these people clamoring to a garden center to see some great new plant in a magazine, and there's like one of them in the entire world, and it's happened before, believe me. So I think that is also another thing that we have learned that there's breeders will not introduce anything unless it's called seed in the bag, unless they have enough seed if it's a seed item, or they have enough propagules if it's a vegetative item. And but sometimes we get carried away, and especially people like us. Oh, I'm going to show you this great new hellebore, and there aren't any. And of course, the garden centers are the ones that really have to stay on top of this because it's hard for them, and that's why you get good nurseries. And I just mentioned the Perennial Farm because I work with them, but there's a ton of great nurseries who grow these things. And the garden centers know who they are, and they just got to be sure that they're on top of the things. But it all comes down, like you said, Kathy, to solutions. It
Hmm.
really does. That's why we have plants in there that are successful.
Yeah, and I can't even imagine the business behind supply and demand for living things like
Yeah,
plants.
yeah.
You just can't, crank out 1,000 more little mini tomatoes. When they sell out that weekend, you're like, well, that's going to be another 6 or 8 weeks, and by that
Well,
time, that season is over.
it is a living thing, that's for sure.
Hmm.
And all living and being a living thing, we as gardeners have to have patience. I tell the story many times of when something dies, I say my little prayer, and then I say, okay, what else can I put in there? Um, and that's really that's really who we do. I really want to keep these things growing as long as I can because I love them, and some of them mean something to me. But if unfortunately it passes away, there are a ton of more plants that I haven't tried yet.
Yep, just more room for something new.
It is true. It is true. That's a terrible way to approach it, but it is true.
Yep. Well, and also, what we're looking for in new plants, and we get excited about something, and maybe it's not available, just gives you something to look
It
forward
does.
to for the next growing season, because we're all foaming at the mouth for that one perfect, hosta or whatever it
Yep,
might
yep.
be,
You
and
know,
that does
if
drive up the price. Yep.
if nothing else, where we put this whole gardening thing in perspective is it gives us something to look forward to. I mean, whether it's a seed you're putting in the ground and it's going to be a whatever, a tomato, or whether it's a sapling that's going to be a tree, or whether it's a bulb that's going to be a lily, it gives us something to look forward to. And how fortunate we are to have that in our love, that we can go out and always have something to look forward to. Lots of people do not. And
Mhm.
we're very, very, very fortunate there.
So true. And one of the new plants I was looking at that was coming out of the MANTS presentations was the new Delphinium
Oh,
Delgenius
yeah,
series.
yeah,
And I don't know about you, Alan, but I can't grow a delphinium to save my life. But there is so much being promised with these new
well,
Delgenius series.
I am one of the people that I guess I'm promoting it. I'm not promoting it, but I have seen it. So I've really seen the real thing. I've seen it in the July heat in Athens,
Hmm.
Georgia. It
Wow.
is not a delphinium that you're going to see in Maine. It is not a delphinium you're going to see on the West Coast. It is a lovely delphinium, but it's certainly not that great big, you know, wonderful delphiniums that are grown in England. But however, the reason I'm excited and I'm really afraid to promote it too heavily because it's brand new. So while we talk about improvements, this is definitely an improvement because it gets some heat tolerance. And there's been a lot of breeding of delphiniums, the smaller delphiniums, so those are the ones that are going to have the heat tolerance. But they really haven't panned out. Now, whether this one does or not, I don't know. But at least I can say I have seen it. I enjoy it. I have photos of it, and it's certainly worth a try. So if your gardeners in the Mid-Atlantic can find Delgenius, and they may even again find it online, as I mentioned,
Hmm.
give it a go. What do you got to lose? And because I
Yeah.
can't, none of us can grow a delphinium to save our lives. I mean, forget about it.
Not the old-fashioned ones from seed here in the heat and humidity.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
yeah, this Genius series has me really excited, but it does still have a few years to be proven that
Oh,
it will
oh,
come back every year for us maybe.
well,
But it may be
I'm gonna,
treated as annual.
I'm going to know. Again, I don't. You're in the DC Mid Atlantic, or you're colder than we are, of course. But I mean, delphiniums have no problem with cold. That's not the issue. So whether they can make it through the summer with enough energy to make it through the winter, that's the question. And so I'm going to know in a few weeks here whether they're going to come back or not. But even if they don't, it's an improvement. That's as much as I'm really prepared to say. But I'm looking forward
Mhm.
to seeing how they do.
Yeah, and that'll be exciting to hear. So, in some of the future of plants, we're talking about improvements. Maybe to the home gardener, it's not evident what the improvement is, but what are breeders looking for? They're looking for stems that stand up and are stronger and face the
Well,
flowers up, capture the attention of the consumer.
okay, let's put it in perspective. Somebody this morning asked me a question. Said, I want the down and dirty. I want to really know what's going on. So let's put this breeding in perspective. Breeders are breeding plants for the ability to sell plants, of course. And they're not, and I don't get me wrong here, the gardener is extraordinarily important in the whole equation of plants that are sold. But the most important person is the box store and the huge garden centers, and of course the landscapers who don't even see a retail price. Those are the people that are going to buy numbers of plants. Your neighbor is going to buy two or three. Maybe they're going to buy 20 different things. They're still only going to buy two or three of anything. Uh, so it's the landscaper and the box store that's buying the numbers, and those are the plants that the breeders are concentrating on. Again, we can come back to another podcast and really have a grand old time this whole breeding thing, and I'll probably get thrown out of here by the breeders. But having said that, the the gardener is still going to be able to pick up great plants, but they're breeding for low maintenance. That's quite true. That's what they're breeding for. They're breeding for short and compact plants, whereas those big plants that used to be part of the garden, you had to stake them. Well, I enjoy staking some plants, but most people don't. So, and certainly the garden center or the retailer, the last thing they want on their shelf is a plant that's going to fall over. So the breeding in general, if there is one thing I can tell you about breeding, it's all about low maintenance. And all of us want lower maintenance, but if we're gardeners, we understand there's no such thing as no maintenance. So the gardener's um, definitely getting a better plant, but it's maybe just secondary because the landscaper has abandoned a better plant.
Yeah, and there's also something to be said for having it in flower at the time the customer comes in. So
Oh,
I
absolutely.
see a lot of breeding for remontant, I guess is the
Yeah,
term,
yeah,
for reblooming and or longer lasting blooms.
yeah. Well, and that of course, don't get me wrong, the breeders are doing a fabulous job. They truly are. And when I say that maybe the gardener isn't their first target, that doesn't mean they're not a important target. Remontant flowering, especially on hydrangeas. That's been the big deal with hydrangeas. Endless summer. Uh, I know the entire history of endless summer, and it was just again a lucky find that it was a plant that was blooming in the summertime, or even later in the summer than it should have been, and so it was actually blooming on new wood as well as old wood. But and certainly more persistent flowering is always wanted by anybody in the business, whether it's the garden center it'll stay in flower longer at the garden center or stay in flower longer in the garden. So longer persistent flowering, and of course disease resistance and all those other kind of things. They're all part of the breeding process. And if they are done well, we as gardeners, boy, yeah, we tend to benefit.
Hmm.
So let me just mention one last. I'll mention a couple of things. You can cut me off anytime. There's a
Hmm.
couple of other plants I want to draw your attention to when you're talking about breeding and what's new and is it just an improvement. So I know that crepe myrtles have caught on in the DC area and in the Mid-Atlantic, and they were thought always to be a southern plant, and they never went too far north. But well, crepe myrtles are trees or shrubs. Well, the newest breeding in crepe myrtles, that's out of Pennsylvania, are for essentially crepe myrtles that may be knee high at very most. They're not. They're almost to the point of a bedding plant, and and I love this thing because here's a plant that we have. We can grow 30-foot trees. We can crepe myrtle to them, and we can cut them back, and they still come back. But here's some breeding now that I can put in my garden, and it's going to be essentially at best a small shrub, and it's going to flower like a crepe myrtle in the summertime with wonderful blooms. And I think this breeding, like this Delgenius, is not a new not a new species, but it's certainly a new idea. And the last one I'm going to mention in breeding, and we can come back to this if you want, is I think most of you who are listening know that there was a huge problem with bedding impatiens. Uh, Bedding
Mhm.
impatiens, I'll say 5 years ago, even certainly 8 years ago, were the number one selling plant in the world as far as, from cuttings or from seed or planted by landscapers, because they were one of the very few plants that flowered all season in the shade. Most of our native plants that are shade tolerant tend to be spring. But this was a plant that everybody could use. And of course, it didn't take any brains to see that they were used everywhere. Well, about again 5 years ago or maybe more, this disease called downy mildew started affecting them, and it wiped out all of them. Essentially, wiped out the entire market. So those people who were breeding impatiens, man, it was like it was like the travel industry. All of a sudden, they didn't have one. And so the breeding, however, 2 years ago has come out with two, at least two, and maybe more. I'm not quite up to scratch as I should be. Two groups of bedding impatiens that are no longer downy mildew susceptible. That's huge because that's a plant that we all miss. And so I've had them in my garden. One is called Beacon. So if you're going out to your garden center and you're looking for bedding impatiens and you've had this problem of downy mildew, go for the Beacon series or one called Imara, Imara. Both of those are downy mildew resistant, or at least more downy mildew resistant than the old stuff. So those are two examples, Kathy, of I think some really cool breeding that's going on. That not necessarily are reinventing the world, but certainly making improvements.
Yeah, and that impatience improvement is so needed. It was so heartbreaking
Oh,
not to have them as, the backbone of some of the shade garden and containers. And you're like, what do
oh,
I have left? Terrenia?
yeah.
And
I mean, there really
so,
was no. I mean, there are lots of things we tried to
mhm,
fill in, but nothing. There's just nothing quite like it. So anyway,
no,
you're right. It's nice to see them back in.
exactly. And I wanted to ask you, and this is probably going to be the toughest question of our talk today,
Uh-oh,
is if you had a magic wand
uh-oh.
and you could breed any plant today, what would it be? What would be that one or maybe a couple different
Hmm.
plants that you'd say, I've always wanted this?
Well, I guess I'm not exactly sure if I can even answer it. I'll tell you because I used to be able to answer those questions really easily. Give me a smaller phlox that doesn't get mildew. Well, they've done it. Give me a lavender that I can grow even a little bit of heat and a little bit of moisture. Well, they've done it. And I say they, whoever they are. So I guess I'm still waiting for things like give me a lupin. If I could do lupins like the English and get some heat tolerant, and this delphinium, maybe it's going to be as good as we hope it's going to be. And I think give me, and I think we're just getting close on some of these things, but give me a woodland phlox, some native my native phloxes that will flower for a longer period of time.
Mhm.
Because I love my native stuff. Give me a bloodroot. I don't. There's an example of nobody's going to be working on breeding bloodroot. I mean, it's just there's no money in it. These things they're by nature they come and they go. But give me a bloodroot that flowers for a little bit longer period of time, stuff like that. And I'll tell you one thing that did happen. When I said, if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said, give me a spigelia, Indian pinks. Give me one that I can just get easily, and I can get them in my garden. So it's not like I have to go to some native plant nursery and hope I can find one for $33. And now the spigelia are on the marketplace. So I'm not answering your question as well as I'd like to, and if I thought more about it, I'm sure I'll come up with something when I leave you. But those are some things that are
Oh
fun to
yeah,
talk
I think those are all great. And the great point about the new Spigelia, I'm so excited that
about.
that's now going to be commonly available. I heard from so many native plant growers and sellers over the years that how hard it is to
Yeah,
propagate,
yeah,
and it would sell out immediately and people were, clamoring for that. So, Yeah, that's going to be a great one to have now in the regular garden center.
Yeah, that's right.
Not
Garden
just native
garden center.
specialty. Yeah, not and being able to propagate it and have it. I would say if I had a magic wand, what I would wish for, similar to you, in the lupines and the delphiniums, would be peonies
Yeah.
that rebloomed all season.
God,
I'm not going to ask for too much, right? I'm going
no.
to ask for a reblooming peony and that stays evergreen and
Oh,
doesn't
golly.
get
Good
any
luck.
of the
Well,
powdery mildew. Yeah.
it's interesting. I've almost kind of given up on peonies, but people keep saying, no, no, this one's a good one. So I'm going to
Mhm.
try some again this summer. But I'm like you. Boy, that to me really needs improvement.
Yeah, I don't see anybody working too much in the peony aside from the woody ones,
Yeah,
but
but
in
even
the
the
herbaceous, yeah.
peony market now is all about cut flowers. So
Hmm.
it doesn't really matter if it gets little stuff on the leaves, but we'll the gardener will benefit eventually with that too.
Yeah, that will look good too. So, thank you so much for sharing all your plant experience, your wisdom, your new favorites, and maybe a few stories about old favorites. But let's tell our listeners you had a special offer for them.
Well, Kathy, I think anybody who listens to us and listens for this length of time deserves a bonus. Um, and again, I wish I was there. And I had some meeting, I had some talks in the DC area, but they've all fallen through, of course. But if you go to my website, allanarmitage.net, and you go to my books, and it's easy to find, and I've got a bunch of books on there. I think for those who are listening, or if you're friends, if you wish to order a book, there's a little place to put a code in, or a discount code. And if you put in Kathy, for our famous Kathy that we're all listening to here, if you put in Kathy, we'll give you free postage. And some of these books are quite heavy, so you're doing just fine, thank you. But that's
Yeah,
only
that's a
one book
great.
for 100 books or whatever. So just take advantage of that. We'll keep it on for a little bit, but I want to thank everybody, and especially you, Kathy, for putting up with me.
Well, thank you. And just to spell it out for everybody who might be listening and not have a pen on them, Kathy's with a K, ends with a Y, Kathy. Allan has two L's
Mm,
and ALLANARMITAGE .net, correct?
correct.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And let's give another plug for your plant app.
Yeah.
And so if you do have your smartphone in your hand and you're listening to many listeners are listening on their podcast that way.
Mm.
So they would just go over to the App Store and enter Armitage.
Armitage's great garden plants, and I have to tell you, costs a fortune. It costs you a ton of money. It costs you $4.99 forever. And I'm always upgrading it. I'm always updating it. I'm putting new photos, new cultivars, new this is and new that's. And I think that if you, I mean, you're not going to regret you're spending $5 truly. But
Mhm.
anyway, I thank you for the little plug. But it's great. I think so many people have this. Garden centers have it, and the garden centers are listed on it. And now it's just got a ton of stuff on it. It's great fun.
Great. And it's a great resource just to have in your pocket right there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's something I work on all the time. So and it's just something I think that people really appreciate having a little bit of a solution in your back pocket.
Well, I'm going to check in with you in a few weeks to hear about those delphiniums coming back. And hopefully we'll run into each other
You
soon,
bet.
post COVID, in a safe place at another new plant showcase or event or trade show soon.
You bet. Well, again, I can't wait to. We'll do this again, I hope, and uh, we shall be in touch. And everybody, if you ever get to beautiful Athens, Georgia, when the travel is good again, come see me. Great fun.
Your gardens may be dormant in winter, but local garden centers, nurseries, growers, and landscape designers don't take a break. They spend the start of the year attending the Mid-Atlantic Nursery Trade Show, also known as MANTS. Normally this takes place in downtown Baltimore, but this year, of course, with COVID-19 happening, it's all virtual. While the show is only open to the horticultural trade, the garden media is allowed access, and following my usual routine, even though we're not in person, I still sought out those quote-unquote back rows of newest companies and small vendors. I want to know what's new, what is coming on the market, and what's maybe getting overlooked. So I attended several of the talks that were offered online by growers and breeders and wholesale companies. And I just want to share a few of those fun things that I came across. First was from Monrovia's 2021 Featured Plants collection. They have a new series of ground cover roses called Nitty Gritty, and these are colorful, carefree shrubs that stay 3 to 4 feet, and they have a fragrance. So a one up on a lot of the other low maintenance ground cover roses that are currently on the market. Next, Monrovia talked about a new Astilbe line that they're offering, and one of them is very late blooming in the season, so that you still have a range of Astilbe going over several weeks. So I'm really excited about that one. Next is a Centaurea, and this is an annual for the Mid-Atlantic area, and it's called Snowy Owl. And the purpose of this plant is not for the blooms, but for the really silvery, fuzzy foliage. So it's kind of a short, compact background plant I can see for beddings and containers. Next in their annuals for our area are Stand-Up Fuchsia. And just like the name sounds, this is a fuchsia that's not meant for in a hanging basket to drape over, but maybe to be in a container or as a bedding plant that stands up. So again, a lot of excitement over that. And then finally in their perennial offerings, they're offering Sky Series daylilies, and Sky is with an E at the end, so SKYE. And this is a new series of really gorgeous reblooming daylilies. Again, low maintenance, so should be a really fun plant to add to our garden mixes. Next, I sat in on a presentation by Botanical Interests on their new catalog offerings. So they're a seed catalog based in Colorado, and a lot of great things coming out of there. One thing that caught my eye was the radish rat's tail. Now that's an interesting name, right? And that refers not to the radish itself, the underground plant, but for the pods, the seed pods it's going to create once it goes to flower and set seeds. And so they're marketing it to grow the seed pod, which I think is really interesting. And they're describing it as crisp with a hint of spiciness, delicious, fresh cooked or pickled. And last year I grew radish and let them go to seed and harvested the seed pods. And I have to say that they are really great thrown into a salad or a stir fry. So I highly recommend that radish rat's tail for trying that out this year. Another talk I attended was with Raymond Evison, famous clematis breeder, and he is based on the Isle of Guernsey, not far from the shores of France, but still in the UK. And he has some wonderful clematis that he is offering. I can't single out one single one. I want them all. And his breeding program aims to make them, a lot of them, to be more compact and easier and less vining habit. So they lend themselves more to city or urban growers or small space growers. So I think that's a great thing to have and still have those big, beautiful blooms. One of my favorite talks that I sat in on was by the renowned designer and plantsman Pete Odoff, and he spoke about Panicum Virgatum Purple Tears. So this is a sport of Panicum Shenandoah that popped up in his garden, and he noticed that one of his panicums had these really pale purple flowers at the top and was compact and showy, and so he selected that out, and they've been propagating it, and now it's going to be introduced to the market through Hoffman Nursery in the Carolinas, and that's Purple Tears. So I'm really looking forward to adding that to my purple themed garden in the back. Next was Dr. Michael Durr, and I never miss any talk that he offered that I could possibly get to. And Dr. Durr spoke a lot about two hydrangeas that he's super excited about, and he doesn't get excited about many plants, so if it meets his test, it meets my test. And those are Azure Skies and Rock and Roll, and these are compact, deep blue flowering hydrangeas, and of course they are in the reblooming or remontant kind of hydrangeas that are hitting the market now. Another talk I attended was with Dr. Doug Tallamy. He didn't recommend any specific plants, but he did talk a great deal about, of course, using more natives in your landscape, and he recommended a 70% to 30% mix, meaning if you can get 70% of your landscape to be native fauna and flora, then you're ahead of the game. And if 30% are just ornamental, then he's totally fine with that. But he said 70% was all you need to create a great habitat in your garden. Next was Pat Fitzgerald out of Ireland talking about Carex Morawai, Evercolor, and Everglow is a selection he was talking about specifically. I love the Carex Evercolor series. This is almost like Japanese Hakanakloa or Japanese forest grass, but it's a Carex instead of a forest grass, and it keeps this really cool, bright chartreuse color. Some of them almost tend to be more orangey, and it's just a great little spotlight plant to add to the edge of a container or to the edge of a bed. I have mine that I'm trialing now in deep shade, and they're still keeping their beautiful color, so really excited about that Evercolor series of Carex. And then Tim Wood of Spring Meadows also discussed some new hydrangeas that he's trialing and bringing to market, and there's several that look really promising for being long blooming and of course again reblooming hydrangeas that are on the market. So a lot of great things to be looking out for coming out of the show. In the non-plant categories, there's a new tool called C Bite. So C, just like the letter C, dash bite, B-I-T-E, and this is like a trellis system that you clip together to form different shapes. So they kind of described it as an adult Tinker Toys. So if you can imagine, if you will, different plant poles connected with these C bites so that you could make a tall trellis, you could make a triangular form, you could do a cage around tomatoes, you can expand the cage over the season by changing out the bites and changing out the poles and switching them and making them larger or smaller as the plant grows larger or goes down in size maybe at the end of the season. So I thought it was a really cool adjustable system because many of us, of course, are always struggling with some of our vines and some of our tomato plants and even peppers that tend to get top heavy, needing a great support system. And then another product was from the Whole Gardener, and that's WHOLE, Whole Gardener, and that's a customizable fertilizer series. So sounds complicated, but if you are into it and you want to have complete control of what your plants outdoors and indoors receive as far as nutrients, this is a really interesting system. So you buy the individual components, the nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., and then he gives you a recipe book. So then you are going to mix for each plant its own custom recipe for the additives and nutrients. So again, this is not for maybe the hobby gardener, maybe for people who are more serious, but I guess if you're really into certain types of plants and really get obsessed with proper nutrients and proper micronutrients, this system might be for you. So that's called the Whole Gardener. Well, that's about all I can recall. It was like a 3 days of just being fed this giant funnel of plant and gardening and landscape wonderfulness. So I'm going to be digesting a lot of it and sharing it in the Washington Gardener magazine over coming weeks and in the Mid-Atlantic Grower newspaper. I'll be giving my impressions of how the virtual show went and asking some of the exhibitors how business was for them moving to a virtual format. So check out those publications when they come out in a few months. And happy gardening. profile, River Birch, Betula nigra. River birch is a fast-growing tree that is a good choice for home landscapes. It is popularly known for its attractive, peeling bark and multi-stem growth habit. It is known alternatively as water birch or red birch. It looks similar to paper birch, Betula papyrifera, but river birch is more heat tolerant, while paper birch has a purer white bark color. River birch is native to the eastern United States and hardy from zones 4 through 9. It can grow up to 70 feet tall, but there are dwarf varieties available. These include Summer Cascade, Fox Valley, and Shiloh Splash. Look at local garden centers and nurseries for Heritage, which is more tolerant of heat than the straight species. This cultivar was named the Urban Tree of the Year in 2002 by the Society of Municipal Arborists. Planted in spring or fall in a full sun location. River birch prefers moist soils, as the common name would indicate. Be sure to give it extra water during any drought periods. It tolerates most any kind of soil and likes a heavy mulching over its root zone, but not actually touching the tree's bark. There is no need to fertilize river birch. If you must prune it, do so after August, as early season pruning can cause a sap to run from its wounds. River birch, you can grow that. Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter by going to anchor.fm/Kathy-Gents/support. For as little as 99 cents a month, you can become a listener supporter and we'll give you a shout out in a future episode. Another way to support GardenDC is to go to WashingtonGardener.com and subscribe to Washington Gardener magazine. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.